You can't go wrong with Now It's Dark.
Hey everybody, welcome to Now It's Dark. I'm Jim. Finally, the movie In a Violent Nature has hit streaming services. Not quite yet on Shudder for subscribers of Shudder, but it is on streaming as of the 28th on Amazon, which is where I watched it for $6.99. It's on Vudu and YouTube, and I believe Apple. If not, Apple is coming soon as well. So yeah, this was a movie that I've been anxiously waiting. It's an IFC film. It's 94 minutes long, and it's got a lot of buzz about it because of the unique film style. And we'll talk about that in just a second. This was filmed in North Ontario, um, and that's a earworm song now from the movie that's in my head forever. And so, yeah, I finally got to watch this. I'm glad I got to watch this at home. I did try a couple of different times to see this in the theater. I wanted to see it on the big screen, and I think this works better as a at-home streaming movie. And yeah, let's get into it. This is a film that was written and directed by Chris Nash, and it stars Rye Barrett as Johnny, and that is our main character. Johnny would be the Jason equivalent, and Chris is played by Andrea Pavlovic, and she would be the final girl. You can pick any of the different final girls from any of the Friday the 13th films. This movie is hard to describe without continuously comparing it to Friday the 13th. Um, I'm sure that Chris Nash was aware of and is aware of that is an impossible thing to do without, and maybe that was the intent, anyways. So, if you don't know, the whole craziness of this movie is that it's shot uh, on the flip side of what a normal slasher movie is, whereas we're following the killer as opposed to the victims. And the synopsis is kind of like cliche, tropey, but it definitely works. When a locket is removed from a collapsed fire tower in the woods that entombs the rotting corpse of Johnny, a vengeful spirit spurred on by a horrific 60-year-old crime, his body is resurrected and becomes hellbent on retrieving it. And we get that whole synopsis scene in the very first few minutes of the movie, and we begin with just uh, Johnny resurrecting and following him through his nature walk. This is truly at heart a movie about a man's journey to retrieve a precious family heirloom. That's the Disney-fied version of what's going on here. It's just a man trying to find a family heirloom. And maybe he slashes and dashes a few people on the way. So this movie has a lot of buzz about the violence and the gore. Definitely does that. There is one ridiculous kill. I know that's been talked about a lot as well. It did not under. It is not being overhyped. That kill is bizarre. It's insanity. My jaw dropped. At first, I didn't think it was going to be, and then it did, and I was like, what the hell? So, a lot of people are describing this as the POV of Johnny, and I would disagree with that to a point because, in my mind, the term using POV from Johnny is that we're seeing it through his eyes. And that's not really the case throughout this movie. We are a few steps behind Johnny, or we're seeing it at a lower angle where a weapon in his hand is in the center frame, and we are watching and hearing him walking toward his next victim or location. And the best I can describe it, and the very first thing that I was thinking that is the best way to compare it would be in the first 15 minutes in particular, it's like a video game where you are playing the character of Johnny, and it's like a open world role play game, and you're just controlling Johnny walking, and then you can hear things in the distance. And that's actually how a lot of our characters are introduced, is just because Johnny is walking through the woods and then hears whatever, and then that directs his attention. And it's so interesting to see that vantage point of this movie as opposed to when we're following like campers or counselors or whatever, doing their thing, and then off in the distance you notice that there's the killer like between trees, and we get that, but it's in the flip this time. It's like we'll have Johnny just in position, and then characters will walk up behind him or near him or around him, and then they make a sound that attracts Johnny's attention to it. So it's a whole different dynamic. It's very interesting. It, in a few scenes, actually created like where we have Johnny, um, just kind of having a moment in the woods, not killing, not doing anything, he's just kind of chill for a second, and his back is to uh, people or whatever, and then a character from the group will come up behind him, and you're almost like, oh, Johnny's gonna get caught, he's gonna get caught, he's gonna, and then I was thinking about it, like how funny is that, because Johnny is like at, is the villain, the brutal killer. And anyways, it's a very unique, interesting thing. I don't know if it's going to be for everybody. I think that's um, a weird thing about this, because it's not so full of action. There's no dramatic background music either, which I thought was very interesting. There's no mood setting music. There's no about to be a jump scare music or anything like that. Literally, the soundtrack of this movie is like this amped up um, volume of the nature, the birds, the chirping of crickets, the water, the wind blowing the leaves, the crunching of the walking, and that is your soundtrack. And then sometimes the soundtrack gets interrupted by people talking in the distance, and then Johnny gets to them. The setting itself is very kind of small, even though it's like this big expansive woods. We have like the opening scene where it's like Johnny's shack, which would be kind of like Jason's shack in the woods. And then we have the campsite where we've got these people camping, and there's a ranger station that is in it a couple of times. And then it's the forest, the woods, whatever, and then there's a lake too. And there is um, a classic kind of a lake scene where there's two girls on the little dock there, and they're having their scene, but we're watching it from the other side of the lake with Johnny. He's seeing them, and they're like, little, because they're so far away. But then this Chris Nash brilliantly writes this lake scene, and it's so interesting. And like, I'm definitely going to watch it again and kind of picture in my head how it would have looked had this been filmed as a traditional, slasher Friday the 13th film. So, like, if you've been craving a Friday the 13th film, and I know we all have been, and you haven't watched this yet because you just don't know, like, give this a chance. It's lacking in, some of the things that make Friday the 13th movies iconic. But I'll tell you what, the kills are definitely worth it when we get them. It's primarily all practical effects and splatter and sound. It's really well done. Um, like without the music, it does change the dynamic a little bit. It does kind of remind you that it's from the Johnny point of view. And there are scenes though that do jump to the campers because when we kind of get the full introduction to the campers, it's with that traditional campfire scene where it's just kind of rotating all of the characters with the glow of the campfire, and that's how we meet like a lot of them. I don't want to spoil, but the ending is very slasher movie traditional ending, which is kind of weird, where we have like a final girl and we have like a good last 10 or so minutes of the movie kind of played out like an old school slasher, like an old school Friday the 13th. So like I would say like the last 10-12 minutes is kind of like a departure from the whole rest of the first part of the movie that we just watched. It does take a whole different thing. Cinematically, this was filmed very well. Lighting is great. Audio for me was great. I'm hard of hearing, so the amped up sound was great for me. The edits were good. Very fun. The mask that he wears is just weird. Um, and it does get explained through some of the story that you get through the campfire, and then there's also another scene at the ranger station, and you get a good idea of Johnny's motivation, so to speak, and it's really interesting. And then we do get, like, I think Johnny himself just is like a classic looking Jason clone. It's so hard. Like, this is its own movie. It's meritable, if that's a word, for being its own thing. But it's definitely heavily inspired by Friday the 13th. There's no doubt about that. But yeah, so if you've been waiting to see this IFC film in A Violent Nature, it is available. If you don't want to wait till Shudder, or you don't have a Shudder account, as of June 28th, it's on all those different streaming platforms: Amazon, Vudu, YouTube, and Apple should be part of that. If you have seen In a Violent Nature, let me know in the comments down below. And yoga in the woods may be something that you never consider doing again after watching this movie.